Thank you, Alex, for joining us today. Some of the folks who are caregiving for somebody with frontotemporal dementia, or FTD, as I like to say, because it's shorter, have talked about how difficult it is for them when their person's eating habits change. And that might include eating excessively, like sitting in one sitting, finishing a whole bag of cookies or a gallon of ice cream, something like that. I also hear some folks talk about this person is very specific in what they eat. Like they will only have something from, let's say, one of the local restaurants, like Swiss Chalet. And, you know, they won't eat anything that you prepare, or they'll go to Tim Hortons to have an oatmeal cookie, something like that. Some will eat very, very quickly. So why do these things happen? What might be your medical perspective on why that might happen?
So from a medical perspective, I guess first we need to understand what the frontal and temporal lobes do to understand that why having an impairment in those areas of the brain might lead to these challenges. The first part is the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is the largest of the 4 lobes in your brain. And what it kind of controls, there are 2 major parts of it that we'll talk about today. The first is the gyrus. The gyrus controls self-awareness, some language production, comprehension, and inhibition. The other kind of major part is the orbital frontal cortex, which is your flexibility, your inhibition, social behaviors, emotional appraisal, your adaptive learning, and your reward punishment ties to a behavior. So when we're having changes to particularly our frontal lobe, sometimes we are much more disinhibited than we might usually be. So we're having more problems, or we're having more challenges controlling our impulses. Looking at the orbitofrontal cortex, so you or I might have an urge, you know, it's been a hard day, I want a cookie, and I might want the entire bag of cookies. I might just want the whole plate of it, but I've kind of learned over time that if I do eat a whole bag of cookies, I might feel really sick after that, and I might associate feeling sick with that behavior. I also might think that, hey, if I do that, it's not good for me, and that if I want to save some cookies, I can have more later. When you're having these changes to your inhibition and your consequence parts of your brain, that's kind of gone. So we might have the urge to have all the cookies and just act on it, and off we go. So I guess one challenge is your brain might not be telling you to stop. One thing also to kind of just be mindful of is that the orbital frontal cortex, which one of the areas that is affected by FTD, is very strongly correlated in a brain feedback loop, which is really prominent in people who have obsessive compulsive disorder. So you mentioned earlier about some of these individuals will only want food from a very certain location, so like Swiss Chalet. So there is some evidence that that might be related to these changes in your orbital frontal cortex. We're having an almost OCD-like behavior now, where you need to have just that one very specific thing. Also somewhat interesting, I'm on a bit of a brain tangent now, is that studies have found that individuals who have either reduced brain density in the orbital frontal cortex or damage to it have a much higher rate of what you might call addiction behaviors. So these people might actually be, from a physical brain perspective, be more susceptible to having a almost borderline addiction to a certain food or a certain stimulation. excuse me. Also, from a physical standpoint, as we age, and this is all of us, not just people experiencing FTD, our taste buds change as well. So often the taste buds become less sensitive, and we tend to favor foods that have really strong taste. And that is really amplified in dementia. And one kind of really common strong taste that we see is sugar. So that's why we might at times have people who are craving the cookies, the ice cream, the entire 2-liter bottle of Coke, because they're really high sugar foods. So they actually are stimulating those taste buds and giving us that satisfaction and that fulfillment. And we might actually have brain changes which are making us more likely to want more and more and more of that. So if we combine those physical changes with our lack of ability to stop ourselves or to sequence to say that no, we've had enough, we can see how we can have our loved ones getting on these kind of runaway trains of having more and more and more food, and quite often it's very sweet food, which can have implications to your body, diabetes being one of them. And there actually has been some studies that have shown that as the amount of insulin in your brain decreases, you actually might have sped up damage to your neurons in your brain.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting fact. Yeah. It's unfortunate, you know, that we age and then we start craving sugar. So I'm in big trouble now. Basically, Alex, you know, the obsessive compulsive type behavior, it's like, you know, that explains an awful lot about why people do a lot of the things that they do. It's like they can only have food from Swiss Chalet and it has to be the same food every time. Like you know, I can only have the quarter chicken with fries and, you know, double sauce or whatever. So is there any way to curb that? You know, medically, is there a medical intervention that somebody might seek from their doctor? I'm not looking for medical advice. What I'm asking is that, you know, is that possibility, does it exist by going to the doctor and saying, okay, my person has these cravings for sugar, how can I curb that? Is there any simple answers for that?
I would say no, not simple. I think that one thing that we encourage is kind of minimizing the risk. Okay. So it's really hard to medicate away cravings. Anyone who's tried to quit smoking probably knows that pretty well. So it could be looking at ways how we can maybe meet those needs without having increased risk to our body. One thing that we often say from my perspective, from my team, is if we're having someone with cravings, I often like to have blood work drawn on them and seeing, is there a metabolic reason why they're craving foods? Do they have some sort of shortcoming somewhere in their blood makeup, which is making them crave a certain type of food? And also, I want to look at how is their blood sugar? How is their insulin levels? Are they getting at risk of a medical emergency because they're having so much sugar and they just cannot stop? So there's always the temptation to try and just go cold turkey and say, no, you can't have ice cream, period. That might not go very well.
Yeah.
If you were to think of you or I, we have fairly intact brains, fairly intact frontal lobes, and pretty good inhibition and self-control. If I were to say to you, you aren't allowed to have ice cream ever again, you might have a bit of a reaction towards me. I know I certainly would towards you.
Yes.
So it can be trying to ration these things out or look for other options. Splenda and aspartame, there are obviously their own side effects and risks to that. But all things in moderation can be good. It can be hard to stop someone though when they're kind of on that train of eating more and more and more. One way that you might want to look at that is offering them a bowl of ice cream or a cup of pop rather than the whole bottle, and
Right.
see if that might help.
Okay. All right. What about people that they have a meal, they walk away from the table, they come back, it seems like, 20 minutes later, and they're going, so when's supper? And they've just had this huge, 4-course meal. Is there any way to, figure out how to help people with that kind of a situation, caregivers facing that kind of a situation?
Yeah, so it's a very kind of challenging thing to address. So one part, it can be really defeating when you maybe have had this big meal and maybe your loved one is having challenges eating or having challenges swallowing or is very specific in what food they like. So let's say they only like their Swiss chalet quarter chicken dinner and you've had that brought to you, they've had it, they're done, and they're saying, well, where's dinner? And you don't happen to have a second chicken dinner laying around and be like, well, now what? Like, how are we gonna help this? So there are kind of two things that are not doing us any favors right now. One is that they may have forgotten they've eaten. The other is that it takes a while for your stomach to tell your brain that, yes, I'm full, I've eaten. There is a delay in the hormones reaching your brain. So something that you can try to do is you can try and slow down the meal process. Easier said than done, especially when many of these folks can be eating quite quickly. I've seen some people who will try and have foods which force them to slow down, things like nuts or things that need to be like shucked. I'm hesitant to suggest that very often because it is a pretty big choking hazard. And as well, in some people who have FTD, they have motor changes, and it can be really frustrating if you can't get your food opened. As far as strategies go, I've seen people who have trialed having their loved ones sign off that they've eaten their meal. That can be really hit or miss. In my experience, there's a pretty high chance they'll say, well, I didn't sign that. That wasn't me. You're lying to me. And now you're in a big fight. What I find often is helpful is if they have already eaten and they're saying, well, where's my meal? Saying, well, it's not quite ready yet. You want a snack while we wait for it to happen. That might give them some more stimulation for the mouth. They're eating, they're having food, and it gives their body more time to tell their brain, hey, we've eaten. Also gives you time to maybe think of a distraction. So think of an activity that they really enjoy and say, hey, the ball game's on. Why don't we have a snack and watch the game while dinner's cooking? And that might give the opportunity for them to move their attention onto that while their body catches up to their brain.
So one of the other things that happens is their ability to swallow some, and not everyone, but is that associated with some part of the brain that we're talking about now?
It can be. So there's one challenge can be with the changes in our executive function, so in our frontal lobe. There actually are quite a few steps to eating, and it might seem to us a very simple kind of task that you just eat your food, you're done. But think about you need to open your mouth, take a bite, chew, and then swallow. And sometimes and these folks get stuck in that loop where they're having stimulation, they moved on, stimulation, they moved on, stimulation, and they're pocketing more and more and more food. They're having a really hard time sequencing that, yes, I should now swallow this food. So other challenges is that I think it's about 10 to 15% of people with FTD will develop a motor neuron disease, either before, during, or during the course of the disease, which can actually mechanically make it very challenging for them to swallow. And that can really increase your risk of choking. That's kind of the big fear. I think that many people who are caregivers of people with dementia, that's often a fear in their mind. What if mom or dad chokes? Other challenges is, this is less so with dementia, more so as we age. Often they're producing less saliva, which is a big aid in swallowing and moving things towards the back of our throats to actually initiate swallowing. So it can be a combination of changes in the brain, as well as physical changes, which really make things difficult. One challenge too might be is if they are experiencing communication challenges, they might not be able to tell you, hey, like I haven't swallowed yet. So if you are assisting a loved one in feeding themselves, or if you are using the insoles to help feed them, and they're having a hard time saying like, hey, I haven't swallowed yet, they might just store more and more and more food until they might choke, they might throw up, they might spit it out. So there are really several factors at play that might be kind of influencing why this is happening.
Wow. A lot of stuff there. A lot of great information, Alex, and I really want to thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it really does help when you understand some of the processes that go behind what folks are doing, right? So it's not because they hate your cooking, it's just they're focused on something else. And
absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you, Alex. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us today. So have you come across this issue when you meet care partners, and what kind of interventions might you suggest to them for that?
This is a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah.
I've had some experiences, and I mean, through my years, there's definitely been individuals who constantly make those trips to the fridge or the cupboards and take food without you realizing it. And other times you turn around and they have a piece of pie in their hands. And then other situations where there's boxes of granola bars and 2-liter bottles of pop. And it's hard sometimes to control and make sure, especially when a person has diabetes or other health complexities, that they're still safe. And as much as we want to make sure that they're, you don't want to put too many restrictions on, but you also want to make sure that we're taking care of their health when they're not able to for themselves. So some of the ideas that I've found helpful in the past, and my colleagues have helped with in the past, is keeping some of those visual triggers out of sight. So sometimes even things like bananas, if, sometimes we keep them on the counter because they're a healthy snack. But if a person's eating 1 million bananas in a day and they keep going back, it might be worth reconsidering where you're keeping food, out of sight, out of mind. So thinking about what's in their visual vicinity and being able to put those things away. If you have unhealthy snacks, also maybe reconsidering that. So if a person's always grabbing at the sugary snacks, it might be worth reevaluating or having them in a special cupboard where they can't necessarily get to them easily. And maybe now and then it's a nice little treat. So I guess on that subject, if you have healthy but fun snacks that have less sugar, those are other, of course, healthy alternatives that would help, when I'm saying diabetes, helping blood sugar levels be lower and better managed. Some other ideas: implement as much structure and routine as possible. Sometimes when there's these long time lapses or nothing going on, I know I've worked with individuals who, after a certain time in the day, so somebody who's, say, doing their word searches and they finish a page, okay, on to the next thing, and they stand up and saunter around, trying to see what else they can get into. So remembering that those lulls, those periods of time where there's nothing going on, same as me and maybe same as you. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I know that there's those times for me at home when that's going to be when I open the cupboard and look for a snack. So what can we do to make sure that there's something else that we can invite that person to engage in to reduce those gaps of time? Another idea is, so sometimes there's situations where maybe you're playing a game or doing an activity, and I think back to like the old bingo halls, and you'd get chocolate bars and, you know, chips and different snacks. And although that's okay now and then, it might be worth looking at different types of prizes that a person can get. So not changing the activity, but changing the rewards. So, you know, giving, I know that we used to use, I know that you guys use artificial money, for example, and then you can add it up in the end and see who has the most. And sometimes just that, knowing that you get some kind of a prize, it doesn't necessarily have to be money. So just reducing the amount that we offer those types of sugary sweets. Another one, let's see what I haven't touched on yet. Oh, locks. So in some situations, it might be helpful to have locks on refrigerator doors or cupboard doors, or even sometimes alcohol. There might be situations where there, you know, there is a stash that the person goes into. So even in that situation, alcohol, of course, is not going to be helpful for a person with dementia, given the alcohol consumption, but also knowing that there's a lot of sugar in alcohol as well. So, I mean, little bits, of course, everything in moderation, but however we can help a person to manage those things better, I think is helpful. And there's also lots of information on the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, their website. And I wrote that down. It's www.theaftd.org. So they had lots of information on there that I tapped into as well.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite websites to visit on a regular basis because they do provide a lot of information there. They actually are putting together a lot of webinars as well that you can access. So all the previous webinars and some of the things on the AFTD website is geared towards Americans because it was founded in the United States, but we are affiliated with them. They actually list us as one of the
that's great
places in Canada that has a support group, and there aren't many of us in Canada that deal with AFTD. I mean, FTD support groups, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's a great website. I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah, eating is the changing of the way they eat, how much they eat, how quickly they eat. It's a pretty common occurrence. I know that that in our past there was a person that we were called her the banana lady because she would eat a lot of bananas during the day. I know one of my care partners talks about how her husband would only eat one type of cookie at one of the, you know, coffee shops, right?
Right.
And he could walk there and he would buy that cookie every single time, right? There's others that have said, oh, I'm not eating anything that you cook at home, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that their spouse is a bad cook. It just that person gets it in their head that they don't want to eat anything like that. They would rather get something from Swiss Chalet or pizza from Domino's. So what I've suggested in the past is that when you order something from Swiss Chalet or a pizza from Domino's, you hold on to that container and then you cook your food, pack it in that container.
Oh, that's smart.
Right? Just so that the person, I mean, I know that it's not very truthful, but it can get very expensive ordering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you want to make sure that you know what the food is that they're eating. Sometimes it's only a phase that they go through.
Yeah.
And sometimes, it goes away.
There's also a lot of sugar, and so when I say that, the preservatives and the addictive factor to sugar. It just makes you want more of that certain food. So that's something I think that we hold on to for anybody, right? So when you get used to that and you develop those habits, it's hard to let them go. You know,
Absolutely.
it's, yeah.
I also had one caregiver that her husband used to drink his rye, right? And she started watering down the rye,
Yeah.
just, and he never really noticed.
Yeah.
So that was one way. Near beer,
Yeah.
good. Sometimes it's a challenge because they look at the bottle and they go, there's no alcohol in this. So I suggest that you pour it in a glass and not give the person the bottle or the can. You actually
Right.
pour it in the glass for them. And the other thing that I've learned is that a lot of people with FTD and the other types of dementia, they often will only focus on, straight ahead of them. So if you put the healthy foods at the front of the fridge, in the middle of the fridge, and the ones that the foods that you don't want them to see, like the pies and the cakes and stuff like that,
Yeah.
you put at the back of the fridge at the bottom shelf, right? So that
Yeah.
they don't actually visually see them.
That's right. Out of sight again, right? Out of sight, out of mind.
That's right. And basically finding a cupboard that the snacks are in has to be out of sight as well. And you probably will have to lock it. And
Yeah.
every once in a while, I would suggest that you check their bedside table because they often hide snacks in there. So, yeah, I've heard those stories as well. So,
The
yeah.
things that, again, those things that probably in our in our minds that we don't actually follow through on are the things that people with FTD actually do, right? Like the things that we all think, geez, it'd be nice to have a little snack in here. We just are able to kind of think about that and go, that's probably not a wise idea, where somebody with FTD does what they feel they want to do in that moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know that I can think of anything else. Oh, the eating quickly. Have you got any ideas on that?
So some ideas around, I guess, the speed of eating, I would say giving the person less to start, and then, just to even less on their plate. And that way, if they want more, then you can have more. But instead of having a lot all at once. And if there's different types of food, I just think about how a person can sometimes be served, salad, soup, and a sandwich all at once. And that's a lot of different textures too. But if you can just focus on maybe one thing at a time so that it slows down the pace and helps that person be able to get a sense of what that texture is like, and to help, I would imagine, help them to kind of modify their swallowing and their whatever chewing is necessary before the next food is offered.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are some ideas. I'm trying to think of others that might be helpful.
Yeah. I don't know too many strategies on that one. Sometimes it's yeah, just putting too much food sometimes in their mouth. You sometimes have to tell them,
Yeah.
You need to slow down, chew everything. They
Yeah.
might get annoyed with you, but basically, yeah, slow down. Try having conversation over
That's right.
so that, they're not constantly putting food into their mouth, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also maybe helpful. I mean, everybody's different, so this isn't going to work for everybody, but in some situations it might be helpful to have some kind of distraction or activity at the table just to give something else to focus on. If you find they're, speeding through their meal, maybe they could slow down by, switching and looking at that word search, or, doing something and coming back to their food. You might find that their attention just draws right to the activity and that they're not eating. So you might need to provide a little bit of prompting, but
Yeah.
it might be an idea to try.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good strategy for, basically slowing them down. And if you find that people aren't eating, then you probably have too many distractions.
That's right. Yeah. Then, then you'd want to remove the distractions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that includes TVs and radios.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. It's, yeah, people just tend to focus on whatever else is going on and don't realize what's right in front of them, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it was great information again today, Lisa, and
Good.
you know, really thankful that you joined us again.
Thank you. Oh, one more idea maybe is when somebody has a lot of a certain food or drink, it might be helpful to also say, like that reward system again, you know what, we're going to have that after we do A, B, and C. And as much as you might get a little bit of resistance, like, no, I want it now, by sticking with it and being politely and respectfully assertive, sometimes that's necessary. So, you know, if there's a certain point where it's like, you know, we can't continue like this, it's okay to be assertive, but not rude, and just say, well, we're going to get these things done first. And then, you know, you and I can have that chocolate bar. You and I can, we'll make sure we get a granola bar, but we're going to do this first. So sometimes that's necessary too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good one. I'm glad you came up with it right at
Oh,
the
thanks.
end. So yeah. Well, thank you again, Lisa. Really.
Thank you.
Okay.
I've had a good time. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.